With the tension between Russia and Ukraine getting worse over the recent weeks, the entire world has been on edge owing to the threat of impending war. While recently the question was why Russia is getting so hostile towards Ukraine. Will this eventually result in the two countries going to war? And how would the events play out? What would be the outcome if that happens? Well, as it turns out, it has actually happened. After building up its military forces on the Ukrainian border, Russia officially announced war against its neighbour. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is in fact already underway. But what exactly has caused this pot to boil over? Why is Vladimir Putin so deeply against the Ukrainian sovereignty? Russia officially launched the invasion of Ukraine by land, air and sea on the 24th of February after President Vladimir Putin declared war in a televised address. He has, however, been denying planning this invasion for months now. As we watch the horrendous events unfold on our television screens and hope that peace gets restored on the continent, let's take a deep dive in the psychology of Putin's antagonism of Ukraine and why he actually wants power over this country. Putin has on many accounts stated that Ukraine is an illegitimate state and its land belongs to Russia. This is in fact quite a complex crisis, and for the answers we need to take a closer look at the history of the region. You might not be aware of this, but there was once a time when Kiev was much more powerful than Moscow, and America was a well-known adversary of Ukraine. Back in the 9th century, when the world map looked quite different from what it is now, there was a country called Kievan Rus. It was home to the Slavic people and their capital was the city of Kiev. This part of the continent was ruled by Grand Prince Volodymyr between 980 to 1015, and as if it were meant to be, the presidents of both Ukraine and Russia have the same name. The following centuries brought about a lot of change in the region's politics, and for the most part of it, Ukraine was governed by the Russians. Both countries were Soviet republics in the 1900s, Russia being the most powerful of the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union, with Ukraine not lagging far behind as the second most powerful one. At the time, Ukraine had advanced defense industries, immense agricultural growth, and it was home to quite a lot of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. With the United States currently being its most vocal supporter, it's hard to imagine Ukraine and USA as arch rivals, but this was exactly the case during the Cold War. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine and Russia became independent. What didn't sit well with Russia and the rest of the world at that time was the fact that Ukraine inherited much of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, including 176 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 1,249 nuclear warheads, 700 nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, and 44 strategic bombs. This nuclear inheritance was later willingly surrendered to Russia in 1994. As part of this deal, Moscow promised Ukraine security and sovereignty. The two countries signed the Budapest Memorandum along with Belarus, UK, Kazakhstan and USA. And for the time being, all was well. Fast forward to 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president, famous for being corrupt, heavy-handed and most detrimental of his traits being he was pro-Moscow openly. Due to this inclination, he rejected an EU trade deal in 2013. This was a great loss that could have ensured greater integration of Ukraine with the European Union. But instead of prioritizing better ties with Europe, he decided to take a $15 billion bailout from Russia. A lot of Ukrainians called it the sale of Ukraine. They felt deceived and robbed. Therefore, countrywide protests broke out. These were called Euromaidan, as they were about Europe and took place in Kiev's Maidan, also known as the Independence Square. The protesters gathered there and chanted, "Sign the EU deal," and "Yanukovych must step down." As expected, Russia offered its full support to the president while the West was on the side of the protesters. Yanukovych's government was finally overthrown in February 2014. The president had to flee Ukraine and seek refuge in Russia. While this seemed like a win for the country, not all Ukrainians were happy with this, as there was still some pro-Russian sentiment prevailing in the country. Many in the Russian-speaking eastern population wanted Yanukovych to stay, and when he was forced out, this minority felt disenfranchised. While Ukraine was now on a newer and better path, according to many, Russia wasn't quite happy with the loss of its puppet. For face-saving, Moscow resorted to annexing Crimea. Why? If you take a closer look at the map, it's evident that Crimea is a peninsula situated in the Black Sea. Soviet leader Khrushchev had transferred Crimea from Russia to Ukraine in 1954 in hopes of strengthening brotherly ties between the Ukrainian and Russian people. As all three were part of the Soviet Union, this transfer did not bear any real meaning. But when Ukraine got its independence in 1991, it was joined by Crimea. This peninsula was provided with special autonomy. It was home to Russian military bases. Moscow ensured that it poses no threat to Crimea's autonomy, despite the fact that many of the Russian top-ranking officials were not happy with this union. In 2014, after Yanukovych was driven out of Ukraine, Russia slowly began to take over the military bases in Crimea, and soon it had successfully occupied the entire peninsula. This was followed by a referendum in March 2016, where a majority of Crimeans voted for Crimea to be a part of Russia. The legitimacy of this vote is, however, quite disputed. If you asked Putin, he would say it was Crimea's liberation, but for the rest of the world, especially USA, this was Crimea's annexation. This was followed by the focus shifting to eastern Ukraine. Here, Russia was backing up separatists who had seized territory in the east. The Ukrainian forces refrained from launching an all-out defensive initially, but on the 17th of July 2014, a Malaysian airline flight carrying 298 passengers was shot down by the rebels. This was the last straw, and Ukrainian forces were now eager to flush out these rebels. Once the military actively came after them, the separatists began losing ground. This was when the Russian army stepped in. They invaded the eastern parts of Ukraine, and the Russian military fought with the rebels to contain the Ukrainian forces. At least, that's what Ukraine says. This rising hostility prompted the West to intervene, and there were talks between Russia, Ukraine, and many Western countries. These talks concluded with both countries signing the Minsk agreements in 2014. Both sides had agreed to cease fire, withdraw their militaries, and Ukraine agreed to hold elections in the rebel-controlled areas. Now, 8 years later, the Minsk Accords remain unimplemented. Ukraine is the second biggest European country, covering an area of more than 600,000 square kilometers and has a population of 44 million people. The country boasts a GDP of more than $155 billion, the per capita income being more than $3,700. Modern-day Ukraine is divided into East and West in more than one sense. While the western part relates more with the West and sees itself as more European, the East is closer to Russia physically and in terms of sentiment. The West Ukrainians mostly speak Ukrainian, but in the East, a third of the population is native Russian. Ukraine's problems seem to have doubled as it internally remains at war with the rebels in the East. The rebel leaders are ruling at least two regions, namely Luhansk and Donetsk, also known as the Donbass region. Russia had once again sent its troops stationed exactly at the border before announcing war last week. Why was Putin hasty in deploying military? What does he want? The 2014 revolution had left Putin unnerved when the pro-Moscow government was replaced by an unequivocally pro-West government. Russia perceived this as a deathly blow for the Russian power and influence in Eastern Europe, as by that time most former Soviet republics and allies had joined the European Union or NATO. So it wouldn't be wrong to say that Putin's resentment towards Ukraine is fueled by the expansion of NATO in the region. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance founded in 1949. The founding members include Canada, Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, UK, and the USA. Greece, Turkey, Germany, and Spain joined NATO in the Cold War period, while many others, including Poland, Hungary, Croatia, and Bulgaria, joined after the Cold War. Now, Ukraine also wants to join NATO, but this doesn't settle well with Putin, who wants NATO to exclude every former Soviet state. Putin's desire for ex-Soviet members to not become part of NATO is just the tip of the iceberg. As we've previously discussed, a lot has remained hidden in history. For instance, the state of domestic politics shows that when Crimea was annexed, Putin's approval rating exploded. He managed to regain the faith of masses he was apparently losing previously. According to surveys, 9 out of 10 Russians approved of Putin and his strategy on Ukraine. The nationalist agenda is vital to Putin's popularity, as he gains points for restoring the superpower status of Russia. Putin has demanded West and Ukraine to guarantee that it'll not join NATO. He also wants Ukraine to become a neutral state and get demilitarized. But none of these demands are acceptable for the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has been urging Joe Biden, the US President, to let Ukraine join NATO since January 2021. Russia has not taken well to these advancements, as it is strongly against Ukraine's alliance with NATO or EU. It's no secret that a huge chunk of the Russian population believes that the Ukrainian independence was a mistake. Putin has called Ukraine an artificial creation carved from Russia by its enemies, a statement vehemently disregarded by Ukrainians. It is true that Ukraine used to be ruled by Russia, and it has barely managed to uphold its independence before 1991. 1 out of 6 Ukrainians is an ethnic Russian, and 1 in 3 speaks Russian as their native language. So Putin might not be wrong in saying that they are one people. However, according to the West, and in the opinion of many others who have suffered at the hands of colonialism, Russia claiming power over Ukraine on the basis of colonial history is wrong. It's like Britain now claiming India or South Africa, or the Philippines being claimed by Spain. History also reveals that Ukraine has been a victim of imposed Russification. Back in the 1700s, the Russian leader, Catherine the Great, was known to have initiated Russifying Ukraine by shipping ethnic Russians to the region. The schools were instructed to teach the Russian language, and by the 1800s the Ukrainian language was banned. A famine was steered in Ukraine by Stalin in 1930, killing millions of Eastern Ukrainians. This area was later repopulated with ethnic Russians. In the 1940s, ethnic Tatars were relocated and were replaced with ethnic Russians. This all points towards the fact that Eastern Ukraine was manipulated to become a Russian-dense zone. This part of Ukraine is rich in resources like coal, fertile land and iron. Therefore, Russia wanted control over it even if it had to force a historical connection. Putin often talks about the Holy Rus, an idea that emphasizes on Russians and Ukrainians being one people, despite the fact that 70% of Ukrainians have downright rejected this thought. 72% have deemed Russia a hostile state, and 33.3% are open to taking up arms against Russia. Well, they better get going, as now Ukraine does not have a choice other than to defend itself against the Russian invasion that has already claimed its land and some of its cities by now. Figures also show that 21.7% of the Ukrainians are willing to stage civil resistance against Russia. 67% are in favour of the country joining the EU, and 59% want Ukraine to join NATO. This means there is no way Putin can stop Ukrainian ties with the West getting stronger by steering the masses. Since Zelensky came to power in 2019 following a landslide victory, he has been a loud and proud critic of Russia and has openly rejected the Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. He represents the pulse of Ukraine. His decisions and actions are a manifestation of the political desires of the majority of Ukrainian population. Zelensky has taken a stand in favor of Ukraine's independence and sovereignty as Vladimir Putin tries his best to revive the dying Russian imperialism, hence trying to overpower Ukraine by resorting to military aggression. With the invasion progressing into the 5th day, Moscow is steadfast on its demand that Kiev surrenders and agrees to become a neutral state. Volodymyr Zelensky has sought help from the world to aid him and Ukraine in fighting this invasion. Resultantly, financial aid and ammunition is pooling in from various countries including Germany, France, Belgium, Portugal and Greece. While Kiev is still holding up, Russian troops have entirely taken control of Kherson and Berdyansk. A whopping 340,000 people have been displaced either internally or have been forced to take refuge in Poland, Hungary, Romania and Moldova. Putin has put its deterrent forces, including nuclear arms, on high alert. Both countries have agreed to dialogue in the presence of Belarus. The coming days and this dialogue between the two presidents will determine whose will prevails. Will Ukraine be able to preserve its sovereignty, or is Putin going to succeed in overpowering Ukraine? Let's wait and watch.